we've now got enough ingredients to start off doing what we set out to do, which is to look at the origin of mental health conditions purely in terms of mythology, or almost purely in terms of mythology and fairy tales. So we've collected a few ingredients by now, and the ingredients are, I think there's 4 of them. So there's the game of God, there's the false creation myth of the demiurge, there is the descent of Mercurius into matter, and an exploration of the fate that is inherent in this, being trapped in matter, congealed in matter, in a lifeless, inert form. And in addition to those 3 ingredients, we also have the ingredient of quantum theory, which in a kind of a way, I suppose you could say it's like a modern scientific myth. And it certainly falls under the category of ironic science. So anything that's ironic is a myth, really. It's certainly not literal or concrete science, because there's no such thing as literal or concrete science. Because there's no such thing as literal or concrete. There's only irony. There's either irony that we're aware of, or irony that we're not aware of, but it's irony in whatever case. So then, now that we've got those 3 ingredients, we're in a position to come to the main stage, the main part of our argument. And that has to do with the role of thought, or the role of rationality, which is a curious thing. It's curious because it's nuanced. It's not part of a literal good versus bad story or anything like that. It's very nuanced. I keep saying that word because I don't have another word to use instead of them. Maybe there is another word, but I'll try not to say it too much. So the demiurge can be seen to symbolize 2 things. On the one hand, it symbolizes the giant symmetry break which created the physical universe, which has parallels, of course, in the Christian idea of the fall, or the Judeo-Christian idea of the fall, that we're in this marvelous state without suffering, without limiting horizons, without restrictions. And then we fell from grace, and here we are slithering about like snakes in the dust, subject to disease, infirmity and death, and so on, in this limited or conditioned existence of ours. So that's the story in Genesis, the fall of man, and the version of that, which is the scientific version, is the great symmetry break. And symmetry is where up equals down and left equals right, and in equals out, and all possibilities are equally contained and none of them are emphasized, as I was saying. And that can be thought of as a perfectly flat, perfectly featureless surface, like a pond, in the absence of any disturbing factor whatsoever. A pond, the surface of a pond, has the capacity to give rise to any sort of ripple or wave, or any combination of them. It's completely unlimited in the type of ripples it can produce, big ones, small ones, clusters of them, the odd one now and again. It can do all of that without any problem, and yet the surface of the mill pond, or whatever pond it is we're talking about, I can't remember if it was a mill pond or some other type of pond, is itself featureless, i.e. rippleless. So it's not a ripple, it's not a displacement of a medium, but it can give rise to ripples, it can give rise to displacements. And just in case the idea of original symmetry and the breaking of original symmetry sounds kind of highfalutin or something, all we're talking about is a mill pond, and then the disturbing of that mill pond to give rise to ripples. A ripple being a thing made up of plus and minus, a trough and a crest. That's what a ripple is. Kind of a little kind of thing that's caused by separating plus and minus, separating the trough and the crest by a time. If we don't separate the trough and the crest, they both cancel out and we end up with the flat surface again. So if we don't separate plus and minus, we don't have a ripple. And we separate them, you can see, because the trough comes first and then comes the crest, or whichever way. But the plus and minus, the positive and negative displacements are separated by time. So there you are. That's kind of an analogy of how the physical universe comes into existence. So that's one way of looking at the principle of the demiurge. The demiurge being not like the devil or Satan in Christianity, but a more, I was going to say nuanced, but a more subtle thing than that. Apparently he's doing us a favour, and we should be thankful for him because he's created the world. But really it's a trick. Does that mean he's evil to play a trick on us? Or is that also part of the play? So really it's not a question of good versus evil. To be obstructed from seeing the truth, it helps us to see the truth, or is what helps us to see the truth later on, because if we're not asleep, then we can never wake up, or if not ignorant, we can never learn wisdom. If we don't get lost, then we can't get found. So it's the game between those two states. As Alan Watts says time and time again, not to get overexcited and try and think in terms of a bad guy who's doing a bad thing, or the devil who's a bad super entity who's doing super bad things. Not to get drawn into that type of thinking, because that's limited polar thinking. We're trapped in a ripple if we do that, and we never get anywhere. One thing about polarity, you never get anywhere because you're always just oscillating between plus and minus, and plus and minus don't really exist because it's only a trick that they exist because they're separated by a time, but really they're the same thing, which when added up together don't make anything. So it's a trick. So believing in polarity and acting in the polarized way is to fall into that trick. So that's one principle, or one way of looking at the principle. The other way is to say that the demiurge symbolizes the thinking mind. And that's definitely nuanced, because the thinking mind, we can't say the thinking mind is Satan, a very bad thing. And yet we can't say, oh, isn't it great? It's a wonderful helper, a wonderful tool. It's made all these things possible. It's a fantastic tool, etc., 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 in unqualified terms, which is what we usually tend to do. But it isn't either of those. It's a more complex situation. The thinking mind can be good if it serves us, but it can become awesomely terrible when we serve it, because it was never meant to be glorified or placed above us in the way that we do. So looking at these two versions of the demiurge, whose role is apparently beneficial or helpful, whilst really restricting us absolutely. And this thing about being restricted absolutely is that, well, we all know violence is a bad thing. So the ultimate act of violence, even violent people know violence is a bad thing. The ultimate act of violence is to completely restrict us, in the sense that we are restricted from knowing anything that's true, and we have to make do with lies and false narratives instead. So that's the type of restriction we're talking about here, which is a really total restriction. Our relationship with who we really are and the world as it really is not allowed. So you can imagine, people can be awfully mean. In lots of ways, they restrict access to resources the whole time, and they say, I want, all the resources for me or for my country or my group of people, and you can only have a tiny little bit of it, which isn't really enough. So we know people are like that. But this goes beyond that, because if I'm restricting you in this way, what I'm saying to you basically is you're not allowed to have any sort of relationship at all with who you really are, or with reality as reality really is. And that's a very violent thing to do to someone. That's a very violent act. You couldn't get more violent than that. So that's what the thinking mind does. It's helpfully pointing out the world and saying, let me show you what the world is and tell you what the world is. But what it tells us is a lie, is an entrapping fiction that we can easily spend our whole life never questioning, never doubting, because it's that coercive, it's that persuasive. So if we can understand the particular nature of the thinking mind and its relationship to us, and whether it's good or whether it's bad, in that understanding lies the core of our whole argument, really, about the origin of mental health disturbances or mental health conditions. That I'm going to try to stick to fairy tales and myths to talk about it, which helps us to see that these are timeless truths. It's not the latest fantastic advances of science and experts have discovered this. And genuine understanding, wisdom will never come about that way. That's kind of a different ball game altogether. So what I'm trying to say, is that psychology isn't the cutting edge of science and technology, but it's timeless. We've always had that wisdom, and the wisdom's there all around us in fairy tales and myths and literature and works of art. Everything creative that human beings do is a lesson in psychology. So there are quite a lot of different choices about what motifs in fairy tales and legends we can use to talk about the thinking mind and shed some light on its character, its duplex character maybe, or its character of being good at one time and bad at another. And the first one I'm going to start with is the well-known motif of the genie in the bottle, or the genie in the lamp. Now, the genie is an immensely powerful servant, and that's why we want to avail of his power, because he can do anything. No matter what we ask for, he can do it. That's how powerful he is. So when we get a chance, when we find a receptacle with a genie in it, traditionally we have a number of wishes, usually 3, I think. So that is our amazing chance to really have anything come true that we want to come true. So that winning the lotto only much, much better, really, because the lotto can't, no matter how much money you have, it can't give you impossible things, and the genie can just about do anything. So that's the attractive, seductive side of the genie. That's why everyone wants to have the 3 wishes. But the flip side of the coin is we're not mature enough or wise enough to use such a tool. If we were, we could use the tool in such a way that it wouldn't rebound on us and do harm. But as all the stories show, and as we know, the way that the fairy tale motif works is that the genie gets the better of us because our questions are kind of dumb and we don't really think far ahead enough to know whether what we're asking for is a good thing or whether it just seems like a good thing, but actually it's a terrible thing. Or maybe we're not asking the question in the right way, or asking for formulating our wish in the right way. So the genie catches us out, and in a big way we'd actually be better off not wishing for anything, because our wish comes true and then we realise that's the worst thing that could ever have happened to us. And mostly when people have the opportunity to have 3 wishes, it does go wrong on them. Because it's very, very rare that we do have the maturity and wisdom to actually know what to wish for. It's very hard to know what to wish for if we actually sat there and thought it. And maybe someone who has really, really been around the block a good few times, maybe they wouldn't even wish for anything. Who knows? I certainly don't know. So the thinking mind is like a genie in this way. It can grant us all sorts of things, and we are very, very excited by it. And we create all these, or the mind fulfills our wishes for us. But then we get trapped in these wishes, and the wishes turn out not to be so good. So it might be hard to see just how that works with the thinking mind, because we could just think, well, isn't the thinking mind great because we've got computers and flat screen TVs and we've got unmanned probes to Mars and all sorts of shit. So isn't the mind great? Because it's notoriously hard to see the way in which our technology limits us. So we could say that mobile phones are really great because in the past all we had is phone boxes. Maybe if you wanted to phone someone up and you had to have the change and you make a phone call and that's all it could do. You just talk to someone. They couldn't do all these loads and loads of other things that phones can do now. So we could think that this technology has been like a particular wish that the thinking mind has granted for us, and it's a great wish, but it isn't, of course. For anyone that thinks about it and looks at the way we've become so obsessed with media, social media, and the fact that the stuff that's on that media, the stuff we're obsessing over, is so trivial in the sense that it's reinforcing a very concrete, limited, narrow way of seeing the world. You can say, well, maybe it isn't so great after all. Just to give one example. And Ivan Illich, kind of writing back in the 70s, before mobile phones were mobile. They might have had a few mobile phones then, which were very big and you couldn't really fit in your pocket. But on the whole, it's before mobile phones. He points out how very quickly the tool can turn round on us, which is exactly what I'm trying to get at here. So he talks about how we can be the master of a field with our plow, which is our tool, obviously, and how that can flip around without us really seeing how it happened into us being the refugee from the Dust Bowl, which is the disaster we've created by ploughing everything in sight and thinking this is a good thing. So what Illich is talking about there is the ecological disaster, and we can't deny that there is a good side to it because it's increased our food production, hugely increased our food production. We've developed strains of wheat that have far higher yields. So in the first instance, there is a benefit. But having wished for that, we're left with the fallout from that wish, which is that our diet probably isn't doing us any good, and it's probably giving us all sorts of chronic diseases as a result of eating modern grains such as wheat, which has been refined so much and which has departed so much, and living in a world where biodiversity is going down and down and down. I'm not going to go on about that too much because we all know that, obviously. But the ecological disaster is another example of it. Another example could be the over-designing of our environment. So when we're in an environment which is not overly defined, what that means is that an environment that doesn't specify our behaviour and specify our thinking and specify how we are to perceive reality. So when you have a very highly specified environment, say you go into a modern day leisure centre and you go bowling, that's a highly specialised environment because all you can do there is bowling, really. And that's fine, but it's so highly specified. The environment controls us, basically. It tells us how to behave and it tells us how to think without us really realising it. And the whole of modern culture has become super defining in that way. So we have all these needs, and then we create an environment that facilitates these needs. And then we tend to think, oh, that's great, I have such a sophisticated environment because it enables me to fulfill these needs. And we lose sight of the fact that actually these needs have been implanted us in the first place, and they're not genuine or authentic to us, but they're just the kind of needs that conditioning and culturalization in general have implanted within us. So we live in a world which is made up of the fulfillment, or otherwise maybe the failed fulfillment, of those needs which have been implanted in us, which aren't an expression of our individuality in the first place. So then you get a way of looking at the modern world that seems to be great because it is potentially, particularly if you've got lots of money, so good at facilitating the enactment or the fulfilling of our needs. And we get so excited about that we don't realise that all that's happening there is that we're getting told how to think, told what we want, told what our dreams are. So that's another downside that comes from invoking or releasing the genie of the thinking mind. And those examples are just a few examples just to show. Probably the last one is the best one at showing how our freedom to design very specific environments traps us and limits us. Thanks for watching.